Thanks, Jackie, and thanks everyone for listening to me today. So I teach law at UniSA, and I want all of you to know that you would be very welcome to study law at any of our great universities in South Australia. And law is something that can really turbocharge your career, and you can combine it with any other degree. So please keep that in mind. You're doing the right thing by studying legal studies to help you get a sense of what that might look like. The other thing I want to say is that while you're studying legal studies, one of the best things you can do is to practice what it means to be an active citizen in this state, in your local community and in Australia. So if you do something real this year, if you engage directly in the concept of democracy or lawmaking, it will help you with your studies. It will help you develop something that you can point to in your CV that will help you get jobs in the future. And it will give you a real insight into what our democracy is like. Because the things that you care about need to be in the minds of the people that are making the laws and policies in our country. That's how we're going to make our future better, and that's how your life and your opportunities are going to increase and improve. So I'm going to give you some ideas about that as we go along, but at the end, if you have got a little spark of an idea that you might want to do in real life, that you might want to speak to your local member, you might want to talk to the local council about something you care about, put a submission into Parliament, write an opinion piece, just remember that you're good enough to do that. And also remember that we're so privileged to be able to think about participating in our democracy, and we've got to look after that privilege. So just before I start, can anyone think about a country right now that might not have that privilege to be able to talk about law and democracy just like we are? Sorry, North Korea? Yeah. Any other examples of that? If you're in a conflict experience at the moment, that would definitely be the case, right? And in those countries, there are people putting their lives on the line for the type of opportunities that we take for granted, because we have the right to talk about what we want to change in our democracy, and that's part of what you're learning about. And so I encourage you to think about that as we talk through the practical elements that I hope will help you with your research assignments in your legal studies class. Okay. So I'm really going to be talking about probably 3 things today that I hope will help you with your research and with your studies as part of your legal studies program. The first thing I'm going to be talking about is, what does it mean to put law into an assignment? How are you going to do that in a way that's going to improve your marks and that's going to show everybody that you understand what law is, how to find it, and how to connect it to an argument that you're going to develop as part of your assessment, how to find people's perspectives on the law, how to find good quality shortcuts quickly. So that's one of the things I'm going to be talking about. I'm also going to be talking about how you can get your original voice, your powerful voice, into the work that you're doing, and how you can use that, as I said, to make a real difference in the world. Because in our democracy, everyone's voice counts, and that's including yours. And you want to practice that, and you want to make sure that when you're developing your ideas in connection to the law, you can back them up with some evidence. And then the final thing I want to talk to you about is academic integrity. And this is really important for studying law, but also for doing anything at university. And it's about that sense of pride that comes from putting forward something that's yours. And it's about knowing that line between doing the right thing and doing the thing that might be easy, but might be crossing that line into copying someone else's work or using some other device or app to generate your work. Just to give you an idea about what that means at university, so you can get that right from the start. I'm really used to teaching in an interactive way. So I'm going to go through the slides because I know you're at the beginning of your legal studies journey. But if at any point you've got any questions, just yell it out to me. I love that, so don't be worried, okay? If I say something you don't understand, yell it out to me or just give me a look that I can tell you don't understand, and I'll try and explain it in a different way. Does that sound okay? All right. So when we're thinking about law, or if you're writing something to do with law, like an assignment or an essay, the first thing you want to do is think about, why is this topic interesting to you? So let's work through a bit of an example today. Okay, can you put up your hand if you came to school on public transport? Okay, can you put up your hand if you came to school in a private vehicle? Right. Now, both of those experiences involve the law. So if you caught the bus, where do you think the law fits in? Have you got any idea? How does the law connect to the bus? Any ideas? Who's driving the bus? Bus driver? They're working for a company or possibly a public entity, or maybe your school. So if you've got a job, you've got an employment relationship, an employment contract. That's a bit of law. Okay? When you get on the bus, did you have to pay for it or show a ticket? Right, another piece of law there in that interaction. What about the people who drove in the car? How does the law fit in there? Yes?
All the road rules, like speed limits, and you have to have a driver's license.
Exactly, you have to have a license, follow the road rules. Heaps of laws to do with cars, right? So if you were doing a project that was looking at public transport and the law, or driving in the law, you've got to think about, where does the law fit in and why is this interesting to me? So many of you might be close to getting your license. Therefore, rules about who can get a license and what kind of restrictions apply might be interesting to you, right? As soon as you know where the law fits in, you can start to think about, why is this topic interesting to me? So if there was a law made tomorrow that said it's now not possible to get your license until you're 18, who would be a little bit annoyed about that? Right, so then if you're doing a piece of work about the law, you've got to think about, why is this important to me? How would you feel if you can't get your licence till you're 18? What might you say to your friends? This is unfair. Okay, so often when we're thinking about the law, we're thinking about, is this fair or not? Okay, and so that might be our entry point. We care about this topic, we know where the law is, and we're thinking about whether or not it's fair. And even in that work that you've just done, you've shown that you really do understand how the law fits in to regular people's lives. Okay? You've talked about a concept of fairness, which is at the heart of our legal system too. So you've got all the elements you need to do a great piece of work on something like driver's license and the law, right? What I would try to encourage you to do is, before you start getting on Google or doing any research about the law, think about what you already know. Think about those concepts and write that down. Write down the idea of fairness. It's to do with licences and it's to do with accessing transport. Then you'll have a good starting point for thinking about how you're going to put this together. And if you start to imagine what you care about the most and think about those principles, it will also help you structure your work. And I'll give you some ideas about that. So when we teach law at university, we care about this part. We want our students to understand what the legal rules are, okay? And then we want them to apply the legal rules, oh dear, to a particular situation. That's what a lawyer does, right? So if you are pulled over for breaking the road rules and you are charged with an offence and you go to a lawyer, the lawyer cares about these things. They want to know what rule it was that you broke. They want to know what the issue is. That's what you care about as the client. They try and work out how the rule applies to that issue, and then they come up with a conclusion. Okay? Now, if you're a member of Parliament and you're thinking about making a new law, you're also doing the same thing. So if you wanted to change the requirement for driver's licences to be 18 instead of 16, you've got to think about what is the rule at the moment, what is the issue, why do you want to change it? So what could be one reason for changing that licence rule? What might be one argument? I know you guys don't like the idea of it, but if you were trying to argue on the other side, what would you say? Yeah?
16's too young.
Right, 16's too young. Maybe you're not ready to be able to comprehend all the road rules yet and responsible enough. So that's your issue. You want to deal with public safety or something. And your rule is the driver's licence requirement, and your analysis is how you put those together, and your conclusion is at the end what's going to happen next. Okay? So this approach can be really useful when you're thinking about studying anything to do with law. One of the things I'd say is that the rule part ends up being the easiest because your wonderful teacher is going to tell you a lot about rules, and you will be able to find out what the rules are, and you probably know lots of them already. So if I say something's a legal rule, it means that it has to have a source in law. So can someone tell me what a source of law might be, where a legal rule comes from? Road rules are rules. They sit under a regulation that sits under an act, a piece of legislation. Can anyone give me another example of a piece of law or a legal rule? Has anyone heard of terra nullius before? No one heard of terra nullius? Eddie Mabo? Native title, land rights, any of those things? Okay, so terra nullius, or the concept of Australia being an empty land before colonisation, is a legal rule too, a legal idea. Did it come from a piece of legislation, or did it come from somewhere else? Do you know this idea? It's tricky, you're only at the beginning, you don't have to know it.
I'm not sure.
Okay, has anyone heard of Brittany Higgins? No? Okay, let me try. What about Donald Trump? Okay, Donald Trump's been in the news this morning. He's been in the news this morning because a court has been deciding something about him. So sometimes the court gets to make a legal rule, doesn't it? A judgment. That can also be a legal rule. So there's things the Parliament makes, acts and regulations and rules. There's things the courts make, judgments. What sits at the top? What's the top rule in Australia? We talked a lot about this last year. Everyone in the community did, because it's an important top rule, top document that sets out the most important rules for Australia. What might that be called? Yeah?
Constitution.
Yes, okay. So all of those things are rules. The green is easy. You're going to find the green easy. I'm going to give you some tips on how to find the legal rules. The issue comes from your heart and your brain. You have to think about what the issue is. Is the issue that this change to driver's licences is unfair? Is the issue that Aboriginal people weren't recognised in the Constitution? Is the issue whether Donald Trump can run for president? You have to think about those issues with your own brain first. And once you know the issue and the rule, next comes the analysis. And that's putting the two things together. Now, this part really changes depending on where you are in your journey. So what anyone would expect for Year 11 in analysis is going to be different to what you'd expect for a first-year university student or a practicing lawyer. But at the heart of it, it's the same idea. Apply the rule to the issue, to the facts that you've found. And then tell us what you think so that you can land somewhere, so that you can finish off your piece of analysis with an ending. Because if Sarah comes to me as the lawyer for being done for breaking the road rules, she wants an answer, don't you, Sarah, about what to do next, or whether you're going to be in trouble in the courts. So that's what we're looking for here with that idea. So you might want to use this technique when you're thinking about your work here in this legal studies class. So the issue is there's usually a couple of issues in any given research topic. So maybe a research topic's much bigger and says something like, are young people treated unfairly in the law? One issue could be licences for driving. One issue could be whether or not young people can vote, because how old do you have to be to vote in Australia? Does anyone know?
18.
Right. So if your big topic is the law unfair for young people, you could already have two issues, one about driving, one about voting, right? Then for each of those, you might be able to find a legal rule. Then the analysis is, what do you think about that legal rule? Is it fair or not? Why? What are the arguments? And this is where we'll give you some tips on where to find good quality sources here too. And then, what do you think? Is it fair or not? That's where you want to land. So this is what we're practicing, and this technique is exactly what we teach at law school. So if you can nail this technique, you know that you're doing the type of thinking that we're expecting from university students. And it gives you a nice structure, because you might have 3 issues, 3 rules, analysis that picks up your other sources, and a conclusion. That's usually really easy for a marker to give you lots of points for. So let's look at this example of should 16-year-olds be able to vote in elections. I've just come back from a trip last year where there are a number of countries that look a lot like ours where 16-year-olds can vote in elections. And it's really changed the type of things that the Parliament might think about. Do you have any thoughts on what type of things our politicians might talk about if 16-year-olds could vote? At the moment, they're talking about taxation, which is really important for everyone, and they're talking about industrial relations law. That's what was on the list for the federal parliament this week. What do you think young people care about that the Parliament might talk about if 16-year-olds could vote? You would know more than me because you're the young people. What do you reckon? What's top of your list, big things you care about in Australia at the moment? You've got to give me something, people, otherwise I'm just going to stand here making you feel weird.
Minimum wage.
Minimum wage, great, that is so good. Is it fair that we discriminate on how much we pay people because of their age? Right. What else might they talk about if 16-year-olds could vote, if suddenly they're trying to get your vote? Any other ideas? Well, what about things like climate change? What about the idea of transition to different kind of future jobs? What about housing? Those kind of issues, right? So we saw that happen in countries where 16-year-olds could vote. There's also arguments against this idea of 16-year-olds being able to vote, isn't there? So I think you mentioned, sorry, what was your name?
Zita.
Thank you. You mentioned the idea of 16-year-olds not being responsible enough to drive. That could be one argument against 16-year-olds not being able to vote, right? So if this is your research question, you might have this as your issue. Is it discriminatory, or discriminatory just kind of means unfair, right? Is it unfair to exclude young people from this or to pay them differently? That might be your issue. You only work out what the issue is from sitting there and thinking about that yourself. If you go to Google or ChatGPT, it won't tell you that issue. It is very good at describing the rule. But the issue has to come from you. And if you don't understand what the issue is, the rest of it goes wobbly. But know that you will be able to work out the issue, because that's what makes you care about it. That's what makes you choose that topic. That's what makes you want to do this course. That's what makes you someone who wants to be part of our democracy, right? So you'll be good at this. Then finding the rule will give you some tips. So the Electoral Act 1995 SA, who do you think made that rule? Which part of the legal system? Have you got any clues from the title? Is it made by a judge, do you think, the Electoral Act 1995? Made by a judge? No. Act is a clue for what? Which part of the system makes that law? What do we reckon? Any ideas? Is it the local council? Sarah, what do you think?
Isn't it like Parliament?
Yes, it's Parliament. And the SA gives you a clue. What's the clue for the SA? Yes. Okay, because we've got a Parliament in Canberra as well, don't we? And you'll learn about the different things that those parliaments can make laws about. So the South Australian Parliament's made an electoral act, and in that electoral act, if you looked at it, you would see a definition of elector, and the definition of elector says that you have to be 18. So that's your legal rule. That's the rule saying you have to be 18. If you Google voting age in South Australia, you might get that information, but you're not talking about a legal rule then. You need to go to the actual piece of legislation if you want to be clear about the legal rule. Has the Electoral Act changed over time? Yes, it definitely has. Actually, South Australia before Federation was one of the most progressive states, and it gave women the right to vote before many other countries in the world, but it had lots of other parameters around voting. Aboriginal people were not able to vote, and even the voting age was 21, and at the beginning it was connected to land property rights. You had to show you had property as well. So over time, all of those things have changed to the point now where we've got an Electoral Act with age 18 in it. The Electoral Act is changing all the time because we had the pandemic and we had an election here in South Australia where people couldn't go to a polling booth to vote if they had COVID, so they had to vote in a different way. So the laws about voting are changing all the time. And I say that because it means you have to go to the actual legal rule itself, and I'll show you a little bit about that. You can't trust something that you might find through Google because you don't know if what you're looking at has changed. Okay, but once you've got your legal rule, you can then think about the idea of analysis. So you've got the Voting Act age, you've got the Electoral Act with the age in it, you've got the Equal Opportunity Act in South Australia, which protects against discrimination. It actually protects against discrimination on a range of different criteria. So it says you can't treat me unfairly because I'm a woman, you can't treat me unfairly because my parents were Dutch, you can't treat me unfairly if I've got a disability, and you can't discriminate on the basis of age, right? So there's the idea of a rule saying we should be treated fairly. But here's another rule that says only 18-year-olds can vote. So perfect for analysis. You can talk about these two rules. Are they fair or not? And you can think about other people's ideas about whether or not they're fair. And you can think about that question, what is fair anyway? Right? And when you've talked about that, you might think about a conclusion. Definitely this is what we'd be looking for at university. A very clear conclusion that says, yes, it is discriminatory and we need to change it, and explain how you might change it. Or maybe you say, yes, it is discriminatory, but it's okay because of these reasons. So the legal rule is there, and you can put it together like that with your own idea. And then here is where you might look at what other people have said to help develop your conclusion. Does that make sense? Okay. How am I going for time, Jackie? If I still... Oh, great. So one of the things that we find is tricky for students that come to us at university is that sometimes when they're trying to do work like this, they have problems working out the difference between a primary and secondary source. When I've got that word source, I mean a bit of information that you're going to use. Now, this really matters in law because when I worked for the courts, I worked for the courts for a number of years, and when the judge is making a decision about somebody's life, possibly putting them in prison, when they've got the victim and the victim's family there, watching to see what's happened when their loved one has been hurt, or when they're deciding whether it's constitutional to make a law saying something like the police can break any rule they need to in a pandemic. When they're making those really big, important calls, they have to know that they're dealing with a piece of law that's a primary source, okay? When the Parliament is making a decision about what laws to make in your name, we want them to be thinking about information that's really reliable, okay? So that we have a sense of what the law is before we change the law. So a primary source in law, I'm going to give you an example, is the Constitution. It's a bit of law, right? It's not someone's discussion or thinking about the law, it's an actual piece of law. The road rules, also a primary source. Can anyone give me another example of a primary source of law? Yeah.
An act?
An act, yep, great. That's made by the Parliament, piece of law, primary source. What about that situation Donald Trump's in at the moment? Does that give you a clue for another primary source? Who's making the decision about Donald Trump today? Yes, the court, a judgment, primary source of law. So this is a super interesting case to think about. Donald Trump is trying to run for president again. The court case that's happening at the moment is whether or not he was part of that insurrection, that situation that happened when they stormed the White House, and whether that means he's kind of an enemy to the United States who can't run. It goes right back to their constitution, actually, right? So that's a primary source of law. Excellent. So primary sources are needed for the rule. With me? Great. Then you've got secondary sources. What's an example of a secondary source? Anyone got any ideas? How did I find out about Donald Trump facing this court case? I was not in the US, was I? Yes, perfect. So a news report is a secondary source. If I wrote my legal analysis about the Trump case and sent it to your wonderful teacher and said, your students might like to read my article about Trump and democracy, that would be a secondary source, an academic article. What about a textbook? Secondary, great, you get it. Now, there's good quality and poor quality secondary sources, and we can talk a little bit about that later. But the secondary sources, where do you think they're going to be really good for? In this little plan, if you were using this. Yes?
The analysis.
Yes. Very good for analysis. Sometimes they help you with the issue too, because if you were to watch something on telly, watch a documentary about, say, the Australia Wars on SBS, it would help you work out terra nullius. It would help you think about what your issue might be if you're asked a question about Aboriginal people in the Constitution. And then you could also think about that here in the analysis, right? But exactly right. We don't want the secondary sources here. They can help us find the rule, but that's one thing. High quality and poor quality sources. So if we're thinking secondary sources now, and I'm reading about Trump, what's an example of a high quality source that I'm reading about this Trump case? Anyone got any ideas? You can do it. Yep. Wikipedia is probably poor quality. Yeah, probably. It's probably not the worst, to be honest, but I would put it down on the scale of poor quality. What's something higher quality than Wikipedia? Maybe, yeah. I think that would work. Also, if the secondary source is written in Australia, that gives you more confidence about its relevance to your work, even if you're looking at international things, because it's hard for us to get a sense of good quality in an international setting. The other thing that makes news ABC News a bit better than Wikipedia, and what makes the other encyclopedias better than Wikipedia perhaps, is that they've got an editor. So an editor is someone between the person who's writing and you, the reader. Somebody else is looking at the quality of that. If there's no editor, or you don't know if there is an editor, then that's a sign of poor quality, right? It doesn't mean it is poor quality, but it's a sign of poor quality. And an example of that is a social media post by me, who you think, oh yeah, she sounds like she knows what she's talking about. She's an associate professor. But if I'm tweeting it out just directly on my tweets, really different than if I have written an article that gets published in The Conversation or news on ABC News Online, because if I want to get it published there, I've got to send it through to an editor who checks the facts. Does that make sense? So if you're reading a textbook, it's been edited. If you're reading something that's got an editor, you've got a better sense of quality. Another good example of a secondary source, though, could be someone whose job it is to talk about the law. So if you've got something like a law reform commission might be looking at this question of 16-year-olds voting. Actually, right now, the local government association is asking exactly that question. So if you care about 16-year-old voting, you could write a submission today about it, right? If you care about fairness and human rights, there's an inquiry happening right now about human rights in South Australia. You could write a submission to that inquiry. They would love to hear from you. You're good enough to do it. If you did write a submission, your submission might not be a good quality source because it comes directly from you, but when the Parliamentary Committee delivers its report, or when the Law Reform Commission delivers its report, how do we feel about that source? So if you email me and say, I'm trying to work out this Year 11 legal studies thing and I want a good source on voting age, and I send you the local government association's report after their inquiry into it, are we thinking that's poor or higher quality? Yeah, because it's their job to investigate this. They're pulling together a lot of information. It's a government-related source. It's been fact-checked, okay? It's a secondary source though, because even though it's talking about the law, it's not a piece of law itself. Now, it's these type of reports that I'm telling you are like gold for a Year 11 student. If you find a Law Reform Commission report that's looked at the age of voting, or that's looked at licensing and people's rights to drive, or that's looked at whether Australia should have a Human Rights Act, if you find a report like that, you've hit the jackpot. I'll tell you why. It will have something, possibly a subheading that's a gift to you that says issues. It will have all the rules in there. It will have references to lots of good secondary sources for analysis, and it will have recommendations. So how good would it be if you could find a source like that? So that you can use that to build your own work. So that's the type of source you want to find, because you guys are not quite ready to read the Mabo case where they talked about native title rights and terra nullius. It's a very long High Court case. That's still to come in your career. You'll be able to do it soon. But that's not going to be fun for you, is it? Reading the news is much more fun and you're ready for that, but reading the news might not give you the rule. So you need that other kind of source to help you with that. Is that making sense? Okay. So how are you going to find these things then? I'm going to show you a few places to find legislation. Primary source, acts, that's what I mean by legislation. Legislation just means it's been made by the legislature. Legislature is just a fancy word for parliament. Okay, so legislation equals acts. Legislation also equals things that are not quite an act yet, like a bill. Okay, and can pick up things like regulation if they don't need to make an act. You'll learn about those things. Case law is stuff made by the judges. Commentary is secondary sources, talking about the law, right? So, and you can get these slides afterwards. If you want to get pieces of legislation, acts made by Parliament, as I said, it's so important to make sure you're looking at the act that actually applies now, because it could have changed last week. If you're doing anything to do with criminal law, this is so important. They're changing the criminal law all the time. Last year, I was involved in some work where they changed the protest laws in 16 minutes. They changed the law. It used to be the case that you could protest if you wanted to without being convicted of a criminal offence. They changed the law in 16 minutes to say if you obstruct a public place, you can be imprisoned for 3 months. Obstruct a public place includes obstructing this doorway right here, because it's a public place. That's now an offence, people. So that happened in 16 minutes and not many people knew about it. Okay, so if you were doing something and you were Googling it, you would not have got that information. And if you're writing about the criminal law, its fairness to young people, or the right to free speech, you would have missed that. If you'd gone here, you would not have missed it. It would have been new law and you would have seen it. So use these sites. They feel a little bit tricky at first, but you'll get used to them. They're best to go here once you've already worked this out. You know what your issue is. You're saying to yourself, I think there must be an act about voting, but I don't know what it's called yet, or I know it's called something like the Electoral Act, but I need to find it. So you can use your secondary sources to work out what you're looking for. If you're looking for a criminal law and you're thinking, it's a criminal law in South Australia, but I don't know what it's called, that's when you go to those sites. If you're still trying to work out the issues, don't go to those websites. They're not very friendly for working out issues. They're good for finding the law. Make sense? You want to make sure you go here. Don't trust what they say in the news or the secondary source, because things could have changed. And you're going to have to use what you're learning in this course to work out these two things, because the Commonwealth and the states make laws about different things. Just quick show of hands. If we're talking about road rules, which one of these are we likely to go to? Who think? Excellent. Right. If we're talking about stage 3 tax cuts, taxation changes, which one do you think we might be going to? Right, good. Usually your gut instinct is right. You'll learn about the tricky bits. So this is what this site, the Commonwealth one, looks like, and you'll see that there's different kind of words here. Usually you want to go to this thing that says acts in force. That means bits of law that are a good law right now. It does let you talk about other laws that might have been there in the past, and maybe if you're doing some really detailed work you want to do that. Bills are things that are ideas for laws, but they haven't got through both houses of Parliament yet. This can be really good for your conclusion. Because imagine if you're saying it's unfair that 16-year-olds can't vote. I've found the Electoral Act and it defines elector as 18. Tick, tick, we're very happy. Then you talk about the Local Government Association's recent review on this that includes a lot of different perspectives. And then you're saying it's discriminatory and it needs reform. You can check bills, and when you do, you will find that 3 years ago, a Member of Parliament actually introduced a law to change the voting age in Australia. How wonderful to put that in your conclusion. Another tick for finding a primary source. That's exactly the type of thinking that we're looking for. And if you wrote something like that, it could really count, because you could send it to your MP or to the Parliament or to the media, and they would want to run it because it's well constructed, powerful, backed up by evidence from someone who's thoughtful and caring, right? So that's the type of thing that can happen when you get this right. If you Googled it, you wouldn't find that. you would find some kind of paragraph that says, on the one hand, it's not right that 16-year-olds can't vote because they can work and they can pay taxes. But on the other hand, they might not quite be mature enough to handle the idea of voting yet. Isn't that a tricky problem we should keep talking about in the community? To me, that's something that, you know, is year 2. If you want to show us that you can apply rules to facts, think about using these good sources. Oop, I'm just keeping on pressing that button without getting anywhere. Okay, quickly about the case law. Okay, let's go this one. So when a judge makes the law, they make it through a judgment. And one of the easiest ways to think about this might be sentencing. So if Sarah is found to have breached the road rules when she's driving on her L's, what do we think might happen to her? Yes, and maybe the judge wants to say something about that. Now, maybe Sarah's been otherwise of impeccable character, so maybe the judge were in sentencing Sarah say something like, you've been of impeccable character, I'm going to apply the lightest possible penalty to this breach of the law, right? Those remarks that the judge make about Sarah become part of the judgment, part of the judge-made law. Those remarks go onto the court's website, and then eventually they go into other databases that people can find and research. All right? Again, you want to make sure that when you're talking about a judgment or a case, that you're going to the actual case, not just the news item or the Wikipedia entry. Does that make sense? And I don't know if I'm going to be able to easily show the Ostley because I'm kind of failing at this here, Jackie. Yeah, that'd be great. But there's lots of different ways you can find cases, and when you start to maybe get into year 12 or definitely university, we can show you all the really cool ways to find cases. But there's one excellent free place that you could use now, and it's pretty easy to use, and it's called Ostley. Has anyone ever heard of Ostley? The reason Ostley will be handy for you is that Ostley's also great for finding those reports that I was talking about. You know, those pieces of gold that are going to summarise everything? So it's got all the Law Reform Commission reports in it, and it's got journal articles written by academics and sometimes judges that are good quality secondary sources. So if you go to Ostley, this is what you'll see here. And as I said, you can go to Law Reform and you can search Law Reform, and you might want to put something like, what could we say? And see what we get. Okay, so I just put consent law in because I know there's lots of law reform work going on about the role of consent in criminal law. And then we've got a whole lot of different kind of law reform reports here that would be excellent for looking at consent in a whole lot of different areas. But if we wanted to find a case, we could think, I want to find a case in South Australia. Maybe you want to find a case about consent. Okay, and oh, we have not got these. Maybe it's easier to find the... Somehow I'm still on law reform. Okay, so we can go to the Supreme Court in South Australia, but we could use a search term in any of these. And we can see a whole lot of cases where they've talked about consent. So that could be a way to find a case and to find that secondary source with Ostley. I think I must be getting close to the end, am I, Jackie? Okay, great. So I'll go back to my slides. I won't tell you too much more about the cases at the moment because I think that you're probably more likely to be looking at the things that help you understand the issues before you get into the cases. But when you get up to that point in your studies and you need some help, just please yell out. because there's some really great places to go that will help you. So we've talked about the idea of quality for those secondary sources and the analysis. Where do you find those quality things? I've already talked about Ostly, but there are these great places here where you can get excellent reports and research. Anne Rose is a place to go for anything to do with domestic violence or gender-based issues, which is often something that your inquiries are going to bring up. Human Rights Law Centre, the clue's in the name. Anything to do with human rights issues, they've got it covered. So protest laws, for example, discrimination issues, right to housing, right to education, right to health, fairness for people in the criminal justice system. Great short things to read that will give you links, one-click links to the rule and to other reports. So really, really handy. And the Law Handbook is an online book that's written for people who are going to court without a lawyer. So if Sarah decides not to come and see me for legal advice, but just head to the Magistrates Court herself to argue that case about breaking the road rules, she might go to the Law Handbook, and that will explain to her the rules about road rule breaches. So it's written in a way that any person off the street can read, and so you will find that so handy. Again, one-click links to the rule. So if you go to the Law Handbook and go to the part that says road rules, it will also have a link to the road rule. Then you've got rule analysis next to each other. Big win. And there's some other resources there too. So my tip is media reports and web stuff is good for the beginning while you're working out your issue, right? It's not so good as the main evidence you're using. If you want to have case study examples, usually it's better to get them from those excellent secondary sources than from news. Because sometimes the journalist doesn't have legal training and they might be talking about an experience with someone with a disability and they might talk about the NDIS, but actually that's not the law that applies. If you went to the Royal Commission that investigated the experience of persons with disability, they would have the right law in there. Does that make sense? So you use the news item for the issue. Is it fair? Are we treating people with disability properly? And then you use the Royal Commission as your great secondary source to help you find the rules. Make sense? The final kind of thing I'd just say is that academic integrity, that means showing your idea and your work rather than copying from somewhere else or using ChatGPT or similar apps to generate work, is not just because we care about your learning, it's because we care about you being someone with integrity. If we're going to invest in you as taxpayers to take the next step, to go to university or to walk out of here with your SACE, you have to be someone of integrity. It's the very least we can expect of each other, and you know what that feels like. You know when you're cutting and pasting instead of thinking about it yourself.